The dark story of Château de Chantilly, fallen nobility, and a vanishing world picture. This, early morning mist over a lake, the water completely still. Out of that pale gray surface rises something that looks almost impossible. Pale stone walls, sharp roofs, turrets and chimneys, all reflected so perfectly that the whole building seems to be floating. This is the Château de Chantilly. From above, it looks like a fantasy. A castle wrapped in water, surrounded by deep forests and carefully designed gardens, just far enough from Paris to feel like another world. It's the kind of place you see on postcards, wedding invitations, and tourist brochures. A place that looks like it has always been quiet, elegant, and safe. But that image is a lie, because under that pretty reflection on the water, this building carries the scars of executions, exile, and political revenge. It carries the weight of a family line that poured centuries of money and power into stone, only to watch their world vanish almost overnight. Today, visitors walk through Chantilly as if it's just a beautiful leftover from old France. They admire the paintings, pose on the bridges, and film TikToks in front of perfect gardens. Most of them have no idea that this place should not exist in the form we see now. Not after revolution, not after war, not after the death of its heirs. In a way, Chantilly is a ghost. On this channel, we dive into big buildings, big projects, and the powerful people behind them, not to worship them, but to understand what they really cost. If you like deep investigations into castles, mansions, and the worlds they represent, please hit like and subscribe. It really does help us keep making videos like this. Because Château de Chantilly isn't just a castle, it's a crime scene for an entire way of life. To understand why Chantilly became such a powerful symbol, and why its fall hit so hard, we have to go back to a time when it wasn't a postcard castle, but a problem. Centuries before the manicured lawns and stone balustrades, Chantilly was just a rocky spur of land in the middle of wetlands and forest, about 30 miles north of Paris. It wasn't chosen for beauty. It was chosen for control. In the Middle Ages, northern France was a patchwork of territories, loyalties, and rival powers. Roads were dangerous. Bandits, rival lords, and foreign armies could all pass through the same woods. A fortified site on a piece of high ground, surrounded by marsh and water, wasn't romantic. It was survival. Chantilly's earliest role was to watch, to defend, and to project force over the surrounding land. Back then, the name Chantilly didn't mean elegance. It meant, this land belongs to someone important, and you'd better remember it. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the estate was in the hands of the Orgemont family, a powerful clan of royal officials and magistrates. They weren't flashy princes. They were men of the system, people who knew how to turn royal service into land, and land into lasting power. For them, Chantilly was valuable as a stronghold and as a symbol that their family had made it into the upper ranks of French society. The buildings then would have looked very different from what we see now, more like a defensive manor, with thick walls, towers, and outbuildings connected to farming, storage, and basic administration. This was a working estate as much as a residence. Grain, rents, and taxes flowed in. Orders, punishments, and favors flowed out. But power in France was changing. As the monarchy grew stronger, the families who mattered most weren't just those with land, but those who could stand closest to the king. And in that new world, the Orgemonts were eventually overshadowed by bigger players. In 1484, everything changed. That year, the estate of Chantilly passed into the hands of one of the most powerful noble families in France, the Montmorency. If the name doesn't ring a bell today, imagine them as a mix between a famous military dynasty and a political dynasty. They produced constables, essentially top military commanders, marshals, governors, and high officers. These were men who stood right next to the king on the battlefield and in council. For the Montmorency family, Chantilly wasn't just a country house. It was a stage. Under them, especially under Anne de Montmorency in the early 16th century, Chantilly began to change from fortress to showpiece. Anne is one of those figures who almost don't feel real by modern standards. Born into power, rising to become Constable of France, commander of armies, advisor to the king, and one of the richest men in Europe. Men like that didn't just need a roof over their heads. They needed a setting. Between roughly 1528 and 1560, Anne de Montmorency reshaped Chantilly. Out went the purely medieval, defensive look. In came Renaissance ideas from Italy: symmetry, proportion, order, and a new kind of comfort. At least comfort by 16th century standards. He built what we now call the Petit Château, the little castle, which today forms one of the oldest visible parts of the complex. The Petit Château was not little in any real sense. It was a refined residence designed for receiving important guests, holding councils, impressing rivals, and reminding everyone who visited that the Montmorency were not just warriors. They were cultured, sophisticated, and in tune with the new artistic trends of their time. Chantilly's location now worked in their favor in a new way. It was far enough from Paris to feel private, almost secret, but it was close enough that high-ranking visitors could travel there without too much risk or hardship. When important people came, they didn't just see one man's taste. They were witnessing a family's political message carved into stone. Picture the early Montmorency Chantilly in your mind. Parts of the old fortress still visible, but softened. New wings, more delicate interiors, courtyards laid out to frame views and guide the eye. Chapels, galleries, and formal rooms that allowed Anne de Montmorency to display his wealth, his alliances, and his loyalty to the crown. Places like this are not neutral, they are messages. Chantilly was saying, "We are indispensable, we are safe, we are close to the king, and we deserve everything we have." Of course, that kind of message has a cost. To build and maintain a place like this required money on a huge scale. That money came from the family's lands and offices, but also from the taxes and rents paid by people who would never see the inside of these rooms. Behind every stone, there were workers hauling materials, artisans carving details, servants cleaning up, and peasants whose labor and payments fueled it all. For the people at the bottom, Chantilly wasn't a dream. It was an obligation. But in the 16th century, this structure still made a kind of sense. Society was layered, hierarchical, and violent. Powerful lords needed impressive bases. The king needed loyal commanders. A house like Chantilly was part of how the system held together, even as it created the tensions that would explode much later. From the very beginning, Chantilly was tied to individual personalities. It wasn't just the Montmorency estate. It was Anne de Montmorency's project, shaped by his fears, his ambitions, and his idea of what a great nobleman should look like. That pattern, one strong figure turning Chantilly into a reflection of themselves, will repeat over and over, first with the Montmorency, then with the Condé, then, much later, with the Duke of Aumale. And each time, the stakes would get higher. By the early 1600s, Chantilly had already seen one rise and one fall. The Montmorency family, who had turned the old fortress into a Renaissance showpiece, flew too close to the sun. In 1632, Henri II de Montmorency, governor of Languedoc, powerful noble and heir to this proud estate, rebelled against King Louis XIII. He lost. He was captured, tried, and publicly executed. For a family that had stood beside kings for generations, that kind of fall sends a message. Their lands were confiscated. Their name, once almost untouchable, became a warning. And Chantilly, their beloved stage, suddenly had no master. In the world of absolute monarchy, nothing stays empty for long. The estate eventually passed into the hands of another branch of high nobility, the Bourbon-Condé family, cousins of the royal Bourbons themselves. If the Montmorency had been powerful, the Condés were something else entirely, close enough to the throne to be dangerous, and it is under them, especially one man in particular, that Chantilly would become legendary. His name was Louis II de Bourbon, Prince de Condé. History remembers him by another name, the Grand Condé. From the start, Condé's life reads like something written to impress schoolboys. Born in 1621 into immense privilege, trained from a young age in war and politics, thrown into the chaos of the 30 Years' War and France's struggle for dominance in Europe. At 22, he led French forces at the Battle of Rocroi in 1643, crushing the famous Spanish infantry and essentially ending their reputation as the invincible power on the continent. Overnight, Condé became a hero, not just for the king, but for the entire French state. Imagine what that does to a person. You're rich, young, fearless, and now the savior of your country's pride. You carry a title just below the king's own bloodline. You command armies, and you have a country estate outside Paris that you can turn into anything you want. For Condé, Chantilly was no longer just a country seat. It became the stage on which he acted out his role as one of the greatest nobles in France. But like so many of the people we talk about on this channel, Condé's life didn't just go up, it swerved. After his early victories, he clashed with royal ministers, especially Cardinal Mazarin. He felt underpaid, underappreciated, and increasingly suspicious of a crown that depended on him but didn't fully trust him. In the 1640s and 50s, France went through a series of civil wars and uprisings known as the Fronde. Condé switched sides more than once, sometimes supporting the king, sometimes acting almost like a rival power. He was arrested, freed, raised armies, and at one point fought against royal troops with Spanish backing. It was the kind of double game that usually ends with a head on a block. For a while, it looked like Condé might meet the same fate as Henri de Montmorency, another great lord who pushed too far. But the story twisted again. When Louis XIV finally took firm control of his kingdom and the Fronde died down, he chose a different approach. Instead of destroying Condé, the young Sun King decided to forgive him. The once rebellious prince was folded back into the royal orbit. This wasn't kindness, it was strategy. By forgiving Condé, Louis XIV turned a dangerous rival into a carefully watched asset. And Chantilly became central to that new relationship. After his reconciliation with the crown, the Grand Condé leaned fully into the role of Grand Seigneur, the ultra-powerful nobleman who could impress even a king. He poured energy and money into Chantilly, turning it into a place where politics, art, and sheer spectacle collided. The estate became his theater of power. He expanded and decorated the château. He called in the greatest minds and artists of his time. Poets, playwrights, and philosophers came to Chantilly. Names like Molière and Racine passed through its rooms. Plays were performed, verses were recited, alliances were whispered in corridors. But the most visible transformation happened outside, the walls. To remake the grounds, Condé hired André Le Nôtre, the landscape genius behind the gardens at Versailles. Together, they reshaped the marshy terrain into a masterpiece of controlled nature. Long perspectives, mirror-like pools, and geometric parterres that turned the land into a giant drawing. That kind of beauty doesn't come cheap. To cut, drain, move, and flatten the earth the way Le Nôtre did required massive labor. Workers dug canals by hand. They moved soil in wheelbarrows. They cut trees, built basins, carved stone. For every drone shot we admire today, there are years of sweat and exhaustion that made it possible. Le Nôtre's style, straight lines, perfect symmetry, views that seemed to go on forever, was more than a fashion. It told visitors that man, guided by noble taste and absolute power, could impose order on everything: nature, land, and people. At Chantilly, Condé used that message to repair his image. He went from rebel commander back to loyal prince, and the estate backed up the story. Look at this controlled, beautiful world I've built. I belong at the center of France. One visit in particular has become legendary. In 1671, Condé hosted Louis XIV himself at Chantilly. Imagine the pressure. the most powerful monarch in Europe, famous for his love of luxury and ceremony, coming to stay on your turf. Every detail had to be perfect. The meals, the entertainments, the garden displays, the hunting parties, the fireworks. This is where we meet one of the most tragic side characters in the château's history, François Vatel. Vatel was Condé's maître d'hôtel, more than just a chef, more than just an event planner. He was responsible for making sure the entire visit ran flawlessly, down to the last dish and candle. For days, kitchens roared, ovens burned, and servants ran themselves ragged trying to keep up. The story goes that on the third day of festivities, Vatel had arranged a grand fish supper. But the deliveries went wrong. The fish was late. Supplies were incomplete. Vatel, already exhausted and anxious, believed he had failed. For him, failure wasn't just embarrassment. It was shame before his master, and before the King of France. He went to his room, leaned his sword against the door, and fell on it. By the time extra deliveries arrived and the crisis was resolved, Vatel was dead. Historians debate the exact details. The story comes from letters and later retellings, and some parts may be exaggerated. But what matters is how it stuck. In the mythology of Chantilly, Vatel becomes the man who literally worked himself to death for perfection, a servant whose life was expendable in the theater of aristocratic display. And the party went on. This is the hidden cost that never shows up in romantic shots of chandeliers and gardens. For the guests, the king, and Condé himself, Chantilly's golden age was about pleasure, prestige, and the thrill of belonging to a world of rare privilege. For the people who made that world run, cooks, grooms, gardeners, maids, laborers, it could be a grind that consumed their bodies, and sometimes their lives. When we look at the formal gardens today, we see clean lines. We don't see bad backs, infections, accidents, and the quiet despair of people whose work was invisible, except when they made a mistake. Still, in Condé's lifetime, Chantilly's star was bright. It was a place where art and power met, where kings could be dazzled, where writers could find patrons, where the Sun King himself could visit and see that his once rebellious cousin now knew how to play the game. But nothing in this world is permanent. The Grand Condé died in 1686. With his death, Chantilly didn't disappear, but the glow changed. Later generations of Condés would try to maintain the same level of grandeur, but the context around them was shifting. New financial pressures, new politics, and eventually the rumblings of enlightenment and revolution would start to make the old world of feudal splendor feel wrong. If the château at Chantilly tells you how nobles lived, the next building tells you something even more shocking, how they thought about their animals. Just to the side of the main estate, separated by a broad open space, rises a building that looks like a royal palace in its own right. A grand central pavilion, sweeping wings, arches, sculpted decorations, and a long, proud silhouette that seems to command the entire landscape. These are the great stables of Chantilly. At first glance, you might think you're looking at another chateau. The scale is that big. But this building was not meant for princes. It was meant for horses. To understand how extreme that is, you have to remember what horses meant in the 18th century. They were not hobbies. They were weapons, status symbols, vehicles, and living technology. For princes like the Condés, the horse was a tool of war, sport, and display. The way you bred them, trained them, and presented them said a lot about who you were. In France, no one took that more seriously than Louis-Henri de Bourbon, Prince de Condé, a descendant of the Grand Condé. In the early 1700s, he decided that ordinary stables, even fancy aristocratic ones, were not enough. He wanted something that would make a statement for the ages. Between 1719 and 1735, he ordered the construction of the Great Stables. Designed by architect Jean Aubert, they pushed the idea of stables to the edge of absurdity. The building stretches more than 150 meters, with high vaulted ceilings, grand arches, and a central dome that looks like it belongs on a cathedral. Legend says that Louis Henri believed he would be reincarnated as a horse and wanted to make sure he had a home worthy of his rank in his next life. Whether that's literally true or just a sharpened story, it fits the spirit of the project. This was more than functional architecture. It was aristocratic ego in stone. Walk through it in your mind. Under those towering vaulted ceilings, rows of horses stand in perfectly aligned stalls, coats brushed, manes groomed, tack polished to a shine. Hay is stacked neatly in storage areas. Saddles and harnesses hang on carved wooden racks. Grooms move quietly, cleaning, feeding, checking hooves, adjusting straps. Above, in lofts and side rooms, there are spaces for feed, tools, and staff. Somewhere, a farrier hammers iron on a glowing forge. The air is thick with the smell of hay, leather, sweat, and smoke. This is not a barn. It's a factory of prestige. At their peak, the great stables are said to have housed around 240 horses and 500 hounds. That means an entire workforce was needed just to keep this one part of the estate functioning. Grooms, riders, kennel staff, stable boys, cleaners, carpenters, blacksmiths, cooks for the staff, supervisors to manage it all. Every day, animals had to be fed, stalls mucked out, equipment maintained, injuries treated, and training carried out. Hunts and riding displays required coordination and discipline, not just from the horses, but from everyone behind the scenes. From a distance, the prince could enjoy the end result, a flawless equestrian world where he and his guests could ride, hunt, and show off. But underneath, the great stables worked like a machine that never stopped. And that machine burned money. Feeding that many horses wasn't cheap. Neither was maintaining the buildings, buying new animals, paying specialized staff, and reserving huge areas of land for hunting and exercise. Horses got sick. They died. They had to be replaced. Equipment wore out. Stalls rotted. Roofs leaked. Stone cracked. All of that was paid for by the same system that funded the rest of aristocratic life. Rents, taxes, and a complicated web of income tied to noble privilege. The people outside the estate, peasants, small farmers, townsfolk, might never see the inside of the great stables, but their labor helped keep it going. From today's perspective, there's something jarring about it. You have a building as grand as a palace, built not for housing people, not for education or medicine or justice, but for horses. It's both fascinating and unsettling. And that's exactly the point. The great stables show you how the Condé family saw the world, as a hierarchy where even animals could live in more luxury than many human beings, as long as those animals served the prince's passion and image. For a noble whose status depended on visible signs of rank, how many horses, how many servants, how impressive your hunts, building an insanely over-the-top stable was a kind of armor. In a competitive court society, you had to keep proving that you were that important. But history has a cruel sense of timing. The great stables were finished during a period when the old aristocratic order still felt solid. Yet beneath the surface, pressures were building. Financial crises, resentment against noble privilege, new ideas about rights. The same century that produced the great stables also produced the Enlightenment. That contrast, a horse palace on one side, and growing talk of liberty and equality on the other, is a warning of what's coming. By the late 18th century, the world that had built Chantilly was starting to crack. On the surface, the Condé family was still one of the great names of France. They were princes of the blood, descended from the same Bourbon line that sat on the throne. They had their chateaux, their stables, their forests, their art, their rituals. Life at Chantilly still looked like a carefully choreographed dream of aristocratic power. But outside the estate walls, the air felt different. France was in financial trouble. Years of war, bad harvests, and a tax system that fell hardest on the poor and the middle classes were taking their toll. Bread prices climbed. Pamphlets and political writings spread new ideas about rights and equality. People began to ask why some families lived in unimaginable luxury, while others struggled just to eat. If you want a symbol of that disconnect, Chantilly is perfect. A palace in the middle of a forest, surrounded by lakes, gardens, and a palace for horses, funded by a system that pushed more and more people to the edge. The Condés were not reformers. They were deeply conservative, proud of their rank, and closely tied to the monarchy and the old order. In the years leading up to the French Revolution, they were on the side that believed the system might bend a little, but must never truly break. History disagreed. In 1789, the Estates General, a kind of national assembly that hadn't met in over a century, was called to deal with the financial crisis. It turned into something much bigger. The Third Estate, representing commoners, broke away and declared itself a national assembly. The old structures of privilege began to shake. In the countryside, people heard rumors that nobles were hoarding grain or plotting to crush reforms. Fear and anger spread. In what became known as the Great Fear, peasants attacked manor houses, burned documents, and sometimes looted or destroyed noble estates that had dominated their lives for generations. Chantilly was not just another house. It was a symbol of exactly the kind of aristocratic power people were now questioning. As the revolution escalated, the royal family was forced to move from Versailles to Paris. Power shifted from court to city. Radical voices grew louder. The guillotine appeared as a tool of justice. Many nobles saw the writing on the wall and fled the country. They became émigrés, exiles living in foreign courts and border towns, waiting and hoping for the old order to be restored. The Condés were among them. Louis-Joseph de Bourbon, Prince de Condé, took his family and left France. He did not just sit and wait. He became one of the leading figures of the émigré resistance, raising what came to be called the Army of Condé, an anti-revolutionary force that fought alongside foreign powers like Austria and Prussia, trying to invade France and restore the monarchy. From the revolutionary point of view, there was nothing neutral about Chantilly now. Its owners weren't just rich nobles. They were active enemies of the new France, using their titles and alliances to bring foreign armies onto French soil. When that happens, your house stops being a home and becomes a target. While the Condés plotted abroad, revolutionary authorities and local committees went after their property. Like many aristocratic estates, Chantilly was seized as national goods. The estate became part of a huge transfer of land from the old nobility and the church into new hands. What followed was not a clean, single event, but a messy, slow-motion unraveling. Pieces of the chateau were stripped, furniture, silver, and artworks were inventoried, sold, or stolen. The Grand Château, the larger part of the residence, was largely demolished in the 1790s. Stones were taken away and reused elsewhere. Decorative work was smashed or pried off. The gardens, already expensive to maintain even in peaceful times, fell into neglect. Waterworks clogged, hedges grew wild, statues were damaged or removed. The great stables suffered too. Without a prince to fund their upkeep, the vast equestrian machine could not run as before. Horses were taken for military use. Buildings were used for more basic, practical purposes. The idea that this had once been a palace for horses built on pure aristocratic pride must have looked obscene in a time of hunger and slogans about equality. If you walk through Chantilly today, it's easy to forget that most of what you see is not from before the Revolution. The Grand Château, the heart of the old residence, was gone. Only the smaller 16th-century Petit Château survived more or less intact. Everything else would have to be imagined, rebuilt, or replaced later. For the Condés in exile, this wasn't just a financial disaster. It was an identity crisis. Their entire sense of self was tied up with places like Chantilly. These estates were not just assets. They were proof of who they were. Losing Chantilly, seeing it confiscated, dismantled, and treated like any other piece of property, was losing a part of themselves. For people inside France, though, there was a grim logic to it. If you believed that centuries of noble privilege had helped create a system of misery and injustice, then tearing down a prince's palace was a kind of cleansing. It was a way of saying, "This story is over." But that kind of violent cleansing is never simple. The revolution, especially in its radical phase, did not only target buildings, it targeted people, real and supposed aristocrats, perceived enemies of the Republic, even revolutionaries who fell out of favor. All risked arrest, trial, and the blade. Members of the extended Condé family were not spared. Some were executed. Others lived in fear, moved from place to place, or tried to stay invisible. Being tied to a name like Bourbon-Condé, which once opened every door, now felt like carrying a mark on your forehead. If you stand today in one of Chantilly's quiet rooms, it's hard to imagine how loud the 1790s must have felt. The shouts in revolutionary clubs, the cries in the streets, the crowds around the guillotine, the sounds of stone being broken apart on old estates, doors forced open, chests of silver pried up, paintings taken down from walls. A whole world was being dismantled, sometimes in the name of justice, sometimes in the name of revenge, sometimes simply because there was nothing left to lose. And yet the story of the Condés doesn't end with confiscation and exile. They kept fighting. The army of Condé took part in several campaigns against revolutionary and then Napoleonic France. It lost battles, retreated, reformed. Its existence kept the hope of restoration alive for a certain part of the old elite. But the revolution produced something even more dangerous to them than angry crowds or local committees: Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon had risen from a provincial artillery officer to a victorious general, and then, step by step, to first consul, and finally emperor of the French. He was not a noble in the old sense. He drew his legitimacy from success, from the army, and from a new kind of national feeling. For someone like Napoleon, the Condés were not just political enemies. They were symbols of an old rival claim to legitimacy. As long as they lived and plotted, they could be used as rallying points by people who wanted the full restoration of the old monarchy. And that led to one of the darkest moments in this story, the moment when the struggle between a new regime and an old name caused a prince to be dragged from foreign soil, rushed through a trial, and shot in a moat. On a cold March night in 1804, a young man was dragged out of bed in a small German town, barely allowed time to dress, and taken by armed soldiers who had no right to be there. His name was Louis-Antoine de Bourbon, Duke of Enghien. He was 31 years old. He loved hunting, horses, and the quiet routines of exile, and he was about to become the most famous victim of Napoleon Bonaparte. Enghien had been born in 1772 at Chantilly, in a world built to last forever. As a child, he ran through its galleries and gardens. He belonged to the Condé branch of the Bourbon family, princes of the blood, almost as royal as the king himself. By the time he reached adulthood, that entire world was gone. The revolution had driven his family into exile. His grandfather, Louis-Joseph, Prince de Condé, led an émigré army against revolutionary France. Relatives had been executed. Chantilly had been seized, stripped, and partly destroyed. For Enghien, home now meant whatever quiet corner of a foreign country would tolerate a Bourbon prince. One of those corners was Ettenheim, a small town in the Margraviate of Baden, across the Rhine from France. There, in a house on the edge of town, Enghien lived a strange half-life. Not quite a soldier, not quite a civilian, not quite safe. He hunted, he rode, he attended small gatherings. He had a long, complicated relationship with Charlotte de Rohan, another exiled noble. He brooded over the fate of his family and the country that had thrown them out, and like many exiles, he hoped the tide would someday turn. But while he was trying to live a quiet life, another man's rise was rewriting the map of Europe: Napoleon Bonaparte. By 1804, Napoleon had gone from revolutionary general to first consul, effectively the ruler of France. His position was strong, but not untouchable. Royalists still plotted. Foreign powers like Britain still funded conspiracies. The scattered Bourbons still claimed the throne was rightfully theirs. In Paris, a royalist plot to kidnap or kill Napoleon was uncovered. Names like Pichegru and Cadoudal came up under interrogation. The details were messy, but inside Napoleon's circle, the conclusion was simple. There was a serious attempt to overthrow him, backed by foreign money. Somewhere in this fog of reports and fear, one name floated to the top: the Duke of Enghien. Was Enghien actually involved in any plot? Most historians say there's no real proof. He was living near the Rhine, yes. He had royalist connections, yes. But being a Bourbon prince in exile did not automatically make him the mastermind of a conspiracy. To Napoleon, that distinction didn't matter. Having a Bourbon prince just across the border, potentially ready to serve as a figurehead for his enemies, was intolerable. And some powerful men around him, especially Foreign Minister Talleyrand, did not discourage the idea that Enghien was a threat. If anything, they helped push it along. Napoleon made a decision that would stain his reputation forever. He ordered Enghien seized. This wasn't a normal arrest. Ettenheim was in Baden, a small neutral state. Sending French troops there without permission was a violation of another country's sovereignty. It was, plain and simple, a kidnapping operation. Late on the night of March 15, 1804, a detachment of French soldiers crossed the river, surrounded Enghien's house, and forced their way inside. They found him in bed. He barely had time to dress and grab a few personal items before they took him away. There was no warrant in any sense we'd recognize today. No formal extradition. Just the order of the most powerful man in France, carried out at gunpoint. Enghien was taken first to Strasbourg, then moved under heavy guard toward Paris. He tried to understand why. He asked to see Napoleon, to defend himself. He wrote letters insisting that he had not been involved in any plot, that he had not set foot in France, that he was simply living as a royal exile. No one in power was listening. On March 20th, he arrived at the Château de Vincennes, an old fortress just outside Paris. There, in thick stone walls and a damp, enclosed space, he was held in a small cell. He must have understood by then that things were serious, but he still seems to have believed he would get a chance to speak to the first consul. Instead, he got a military tribunal. That same night, a hastily assembled commission of officers was gathered. They were given a file and told to judge the prisoner. The charges were sweeping: bearing arms against France, receiving funds from England, and plotting against the security of the state. Enghien was brought before them. The trial, if you can call it that, lasted only a few hours. He admitted that he had once served in armies opposed to revolutionary France. He didn't deny his family's politics, but he firmly denied any role in current plots against Napoleon. He hadn't been in Paris. He hadn't tried to overthrow the regime. He asked again to see Napoleon. He asked to defend himself directly. The request went nowhere. There was no defense lawyer. No real witnesses called for him. The officers were under pressure. The message from above was clear. This man was to be made an example. Around midnight, the commission pronounced its verdict: guilty. The sentence: death. Everything moved quickly from there. In the early hours of March 21, 1804, Enghien was told his fate. Accounts of his final moments vary in details, but a few points repeat. He asked for a priest. One was brought. He asked to write to his family. He was allowed a brief letter. He reportedly said that he forgave his enemies, and that he wished his blood would not fall on France. He wanted to die as a Bourbon and a soldier, not as a common criminal. He refused a blindfold. Just before dawn, soldiers led him out into the moat of the fortress, a damp, enclosed space lit by torches. The stone walls rose around him like uncaring witnesses. Somewhere above, the city of Paris slept, mostly unaware of what was about to happen. The firing squad took its position. Enghien is said to have declared that he died for his father, for the Condé cause, for his name. Then the command was given. Shots rang out. The prince fell. A final pistol shot ensured he was dead. In a few seconds, the last real hope of the Condé line was gone. News traveled quickly. In Paris, fear kept many people quiet. But in the drawing rooms of Europe, shock turned into outrage. Monarchs and nobles who had tolerated Napoleon as a strongman now saw something far more disturbing. A ruler who would violate another country's borders, kidnap a prince, rush him through a sham trial, and have him shot in a moat. Even people who disliked the Bourbons felt uneasy. This wasn't justice. It was elimination. For Napoleon, Enghien's execution was meant as a warning. It said, "The old royal line is finished. There will be no Bourbon figurehead for my enemies to rally around. I am the only center of power now." But the warning cut both ways. For the rest of his life, this one act would haunt him. Critics brought it up again and again. After his fall, when his legacy was debated, the name Enghien never went away. It became a symbol of how far he would go when he felt threatened. For the Condé family, the impact was deeply personal. Louis-Joseph de Condé, Enghien's grandfather, received the news in exile. He had already lost his country, his estate, and his role in the world. Now he had lost his heir. The Condé line, already weakened, was effectively doomed. There would be no more direct male heirs to carry the name with real political weight. Think about what that meant for Chantilly. The estate was already physically broken by the revolution. Now the human line that had made it famous was broken too. The name that once filled its gardens and salons with influence now existed mostly in memory. Over time, a distant relative, the last Prince of Condé, would inherit the leftover title and wealth. Childless and aging, he chose to leave Chantilly to a different branch of the royal family, the Orléans. That decision, surrounded by rumors and suspicion, placed Chantilly in the hands of a young prince named Henri d'Orléans, the future Duke of Aumale. By the time Henri d'Orléans, Duke of Aumale, truly took hold of Chantilly, it was not the glowing, busy estate of the Grand Condé. It was a ghost. Henri was born in 1822, decades after the Revolution, and Napoleon had done their damage. He belonged to the Orléans branch of the royal family, the line of Louis-Philippe, the citizen king who tried to give monarchy a more middle-class face. Henri grew up in a world that pretended the old aristocratic order could be softened and modernized. His father walked without too much ceremony, dressed simply, and tried to present himself as a king for a new age. But power still depended on land, wealth, and memory. And one of the biggest and most loaded memories in that world was Chantilly. The last Prince of Condé, Louis-Henri Joseph, had no legitimate heirs. Old, isolated, and surrounded by changing politics, he made a controversial choice. In his will, he left his vast fortune, including Chantilly, to the young Duke of Aumale, who was just a child. When the old prince died in 1830, he was found hanging at his residence in Saint-Leu. Officially, it was ruled a suicide. Unofficially, rumors exploded. Some whispered about murder. Some blamed those around him. Some pointed unfairly toward the Orléans. No solid proof ever appeared, but the scandal stuck. What we know for sure is this: the will was upheld, and the gigantic Condé inheritance passed to a boy from another branch of the royal family. For Henri, Chantilly became both a gift and a burden, a ruined, famous estate tied to a deadline, now sitting on his shoulders. As a young man, he didn't rush to restore it. He had a different path first: the army. Henri joined the military and fought in Algeria, where France was expanding its colonial empire. He proved himself brave and capable. He wasn't just a decorative officer. He led men, took risks, and built a real reputation. By his 20s, Henri had everything a 19th-century prince was supposed to have: royal blood, military glory, and enormous wealth. Then, once again, the ground moved. In 1848, revolutionary waves swept across Europe. In Paris, protests, economic hardship, and political conflict boiled over. Louis-Philippe, Henri's father, was forced to abdicate and flee. The monarchy collapsed. The Second Republic was born. The Orléans family went into exile. Henri was expelled from France. He lost his official role and access to many of his properties, but he was not poor. The family still had money, and he eventually received compensation. More importantly, he had time and a sharp mind. In exile, Henri became a collector. He didn't just sit in drawing rooms complaining about politics. He went to auctions, he visited libraries, he hunted for manuscripts, books, and paintings with almost obsessive focus. When a great collection somewhere in Europe was broken up, Henri tried to buy pieces of it. When a rare manuscript appeared, he took note. When a painting by Raphael, Poussin, or Ingres went on sale, he did what he could to get it. He started to assemble what would become one of the greatest collections of art and manuscripts in France. This wasn't just a hobby. It was a strategy. Henri understood that political power was fragile. Thrones could fall, regimes could change, but cultural power, owning masterpieces, controlling archives, shaping how history was told, that could last much longer. If he couldn't rule France, he could at least own parts of its cultural soul. In the background of all this, Chantilly waited. The estate, partly ruined by the revolution, missing its main chateau, was still there, an empty stage. The petit chateau survived. The great stables still stood. The forests, lakes, and traces of gardens remained. For Henri, Chantilly became the obvious place to give his collection a body. But he couldn't do much as long as he was officially banned from France. So he waited. Time passed. The Second Republic became the Second Empire under Napoleon III. Then came the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71. France lost, the empire fell, and yet another republic, the Third, took shape. The political climate shifted. The Orléans princes were eventually allowed to return. Henri, now older and marked by years of exile, came back to a country that no longer saw him as a future king. He understood that the age of monarchs was probably over, but he still had Chantilly. He decided to turn it into his monument. In the 1870s, he began the massive task of rebuilding the Grand Château. He didn't try to recreate it exactly as it had been before the Revolution. That would have been nearly impossible. Instead, he hired architect Honoré Daumet to design a new chateau, constructed between roughly 1875 and 1882. The result is what we see today, a building inspired by the past, but born in the 19th century. It looks old at first glance, with Renaissance touches that echo the Petit Château, but it's really a kind of historical fantasy, a carefully designed tribute to a world that was already gone. Henri then did something even more important. He filled it. Room by room, he turned Chantilly into a memory palace. Paintings were hung densely, salon-style, wall-to-wall, in a style already old-fashioned by museum standards. He created grand galleries, intimate cabinets, and libraries holding thousands of manuscripts and rare books. Everywhere you looked, there was another masterpiece: Raphael, Poussin, Watteau, Ingres, Fra Angelico. Illuminated pages glowing with blues and golds, maps, letters, and state papers that told the story of kings and nobles. Henri arranged these things not just for beauty, but like a historian. He grouped books by subject and time period. He left catalogues and notes. Chantilly was no longer just a residence. It was a research center, a gallery, and a shrine to French history. At least the parts of history he cared about. Underneath all the scholarship, there was something deeply emotional. Henri had lost almost everything a prince was supposed to have: a guaranteed role in politics, a stable future, a clear line of descendants. Inside Chantilly, he built a world he could control completely, a world where the past obeyed his layout, his labels, his taste. In a way, he was doing what exiles often do, rebuilding a lost world in miniature. Look at the living spaces he designed. They're not really built for a large, bustling family. They feel more like a series of scenes in a theater, carefully arranged for memory rather than comfort. This wasn't a house where generations would grow up. It was a stage set for a vanished class. Henri's personal life made that even sharper. he married Princess Maria Carolina of Bourbon-Condé, Sicilies. They had several children. One by one, most of them died young. The only one who lived into adulthood, Louis d'Orléans, Prince de Condé, died at just 20 years old. Once again, Chantilly was tied to a line without a clear heir. By the time Henri was an old man, he knew his collection and his rebuilt estate wouldn't pass smoothly to a son. And he was haunted by what had happened to the Condés before him: exile, confiscation, destruction. He didn't want Chantilly to be smashed or stripped again after his death, so he made a radical decision. In 1886, he signed a will giving the entire estate, the château, the great stables, the art, the manuscripts, the grounds, to the Institut de France, a prestigious scholarly body in Paris. The gift would take effect when he died. Chantilly would pass from royal hands into national custody. But Henri didn't just donate it and walk away. He set conditions. He insisted that the collections could never be broken up or loaned out. No painting from Chantilly would ever travel to another museum for an exhibition. No manuscript would be permanently moved elsewhere. He also demanded that the way the rooms and galleries were arranged should remain essentially unchanged. Chantilly was to be preserved as he left it. Frozen. In 1897, Henri d'Orléans, Duke of Aumale, died. With his death, Chantilly officially became the Musée Condé, under the care of the Institut de France. The estate stopped being a private home and became, in effect, a national monument, and a locked one. On paper, it's a noble act, a prince giving his fortune and art to the nation. In many ways, it truly was. Without Henri, many of these works might have been scattered, sold abroad, or lost. Thanks to him, Chantilly holds one of the richest intact collections in Europe. But there's a darker side. By freezing everything, Henri turned Chantilly into a kind of mausoleum, not only for the Condés and Orléans, but for the entire world of French aristocracy. Visitors could walk through the rooms and see how a certain class had lived and collected. But that life itself was gone. What remained was the shell. He had rebuilt a dead world and sealed it under glass. And that's the world you walk into today. If you step inside the Château de Chantilly now, you don't really walk into a house, you walk into an argument. From the first main gallery, the message is clear. This is not a modern museum. Paintings are hung shoulder to shoulder, top to bottom, covering almost every inch of wall space. There are no big empty white walls, no slick contemporary display cases. It feels dense, heavy, almost overwhelming. This is the Musée Condé, the museum the Duke of Aumale built and then locked in place. Look at what's actually here. On the walls, you see works by Raphael, Poussin, Ingres, and many more. French Renaissance portraits stare down at you with pale faces and sharp eyes. In glass cases and on shelves, you find one of the greatest manuscript collections in Europe. The crown jewel is the très riche Heures du Duc de Berry, a 15th century book of hours whose tiny painted scenes still glow with impossible color. There are thousands of volumes, Bibles, chronicles, maps, letters, legal documents, works of philosophy and theology. Together they trace the rise and fall of the monarchy and nobility over centuries. Everywhere you look, there's something important, but the whole place feels fixed. Because of Aumale's will, the collection is basically frozen in time. The painting you see in that exact spot is supposed to stay there. The books in that room are supposed to stay in that room. The artworks, with very rare exceptions, are not allowed to travel. Chantilly doesn't lend masterpieces to blockbuster exhibitions in New York or Tokyo. It doesn't send its Raphael out on tour. Other museums can move works around, redesign their galleries, and constantly reinvent how they tell stories. Chantilly is tied to the choices of one man who died over a century ago. At first, that might sound romantic. There's something appealing about seeing a place as it was. You walk into a gallery and someone tells you, this is how the Duke of Aumale saw it. You enter the library and here, the shelves are still arranged in the same way. But freezing a place in time is not neutral. It picks one moment, the late 19th century, and says, "This is the truth. This is how it should stay." It locks future generations of curators, conservators, and visitors inside the taste and psychology of one long-dead prince. If you work at Chantilly today, you live inside those rules. Do you want to spread some paintings out so they get better light and more breathing room? Too bad. Do you want to rotate fragile works off display more often? That means changing the historical look of a room. Do you want to send a masterpiece abroad for a big show that might attract donations and funding? The answer is still no. The result is a strange double life. On one hand, the Musée Condé is a dream for purists. Unlike many royal or noble collections that were broken apart, Chantilly's has stayed remarkably intact. You can still see not just isolated masterpieces, but the shape of a 19th century princely collection. On the other hand, it's a logistical and financial headache. Maintaining a chateau, a park, a set of monumental stables, and one of the greatest art collections in France is extremely expensive. Roofs fail, stone wears down, wood warps, paintings age, manuscripts are sensitive to light and climate. Normally, museums can raise money with loans, traveling exhibitions, and partnerships. Chantilly's rules make that much harder. The art has to stay. The layout has to mostly stay. The story can only bend so far. So the estate leans heavily on ticket sales, state support, private donors, foundations, and corporate sponsors. Behind the calm galleries and manicured lawns, there's a constant scramble to find the money to keep everything from quietly falling apart. On the surface, you see polished floors, quiet rooms, and visitors whispering in front of paintings. Behind the scenes, there's a small army of conservators, archivists, guides, gardeners, security guards, cleaners, administrators, and fundraisers. Their job isn't to keep a living family comfortable, it's to keep a memory from decaying. Every decision they make sits at the intersection of three pressures: the past, Aumale's will, the historical, layout; the present, financial reality, visitor expectations, conservation standards; the future, the need to keep the place alive for decades to come. Those pressures often collide. The dense hanging style might be charming historically, but it isn't great for conservation. Paintings high up can be hard to monitor. Crowded walls make it harder to install ideal lighting or climate control, yet changing that would mean breaking the promise to keep things as they were. So the staff does what they can to work around it, using subtle adjustments, careful restoration, and constant checks. In a way, they're still paying the cost of Aumale's grief and nostalgia. He built a museum to a world that no longer existed, and now generation after generation has to keep that museum alive under his rules. Visitors pay a price too, in a softer way. Chantilly's rooms can be overwhelming. There's so much to look at that it can be hard to know where to focus. The place doesn't slow down to explain itself in the way modern museums often do. It doesn't really adapt to you. You have to adapt to it. Some people find that magical. Others find it alienating. And then there's the bigger question. What exactly are we preserving? The Musée Condé is full of beauty. The paintings are extraordinary. The manuscripts are unique. The furniture and decoration are impressive. But almost everything here was made by, for, or about the elite. Kings, princes, nobles, bishops, the very rich. The peasants who paid rent, the workers who carved stone, the servants who cleaned floors. They appear only in the background, when they appear at all. Chantilly mostly tells the story of how the elite saw themselves, and how one exiled prince tried to rescue that self-image from the ruins of history. When you know that, it's hard to walk through the rooms without feeling a little tension. You're surrounded by beauty, but also by physical proof of inequality. Objects that cost more than whole villages in a building rebuilt as a monument to a defeated class. And yet, that's exactly what makes Chantilly so honest. Unlike palaces that have been fully modernized and reinterpreted, Chantilly still feels raw. The Duke of Aumale's rules mean you're not just visiting a museum, you're stepping into his head. You see his sense of order, his pride, his grief, his refusal to let go of the world that shaped him, even as he knew it was gone. The Republic could exile the Orléans, the Revolution could tear down the original chateau, Napoleon could have a Condé prince shot in a moat. But here, in these galleries, aristocratic France still speaks to itself in oil paint, parchment, and gilded frames. Keeping that conversation going has a price, in money, in labor, and in the flexibility the estate has to sacrifice to honor a dead man's conditions. And beyond the museum doors, another story is happening. When the Duke of Aumale died in 1897, he probably imagined Chantilly as complete. The chateau rebuilt, the galleries full, the will signed, the future secured. But history doesn't stop when someone writes, "The end." The 20th century hit Chantilly just like it hit everywhere else, with war. When World War I began in 1914, northern France became both battlefield and staging ground. Chantilly's geography made it important, but not doomed. It was close to the front, but not directly on it. For a time, the town of Chantilly served as a brain instead of a target. French Commander-in-Chief Joseph Joffre set up his headquarters there. Orders for battles, troop movements, and supplies went out from a place once built for princes and parties. Think about that. The same landscape where the Grand Condé once planned dazzling receptions for Louis XIV now hosted war councils about trenches, artillery, and casualty numbers. Aumale's quiet galleries, full of Raphaels and medieval manuscripts, existed just steps away from officers deciding how many men to send into the next attack. The chateau itself survived World War I without catastrophic damage. It was too symbolically important and too useful to be casually destroyed. But the illusion that Chantilly was somehow above the real world died for good. Total war had reached the doorstep of this aristocratic relic. Then came World War II. Once again, northern France was occupied. Once again, places like Chantilly were in danger, not only from bombs, but from confiscation and looting. Like many heritage sites, Chantilly's most precious works were evacuated or hidden as much as possible to protect them from bombing and theft. The chateau and estate suffered from neglect, shortages, and the strain of war, but they made it through. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, Chantilly was still standing, tired, worn, in need of serious work, but still there. And now it faced a new kind of challenge. The world that had built it was completely gone. Monarchies had fallen or become symbolic. The men who once used Chantilly to project power were all long dead. Aumale's donation meant that, on paper, the estate now belonged to the French nation, managed by the Institut de France. The question was simple and brutal. What do you do with a place like this in the age of cars, television, and mass politics? You turn it into heritage. In the second half of the 20th century, Chantilly slowly shifted from being a strange, elite museum, mostly known to specialists, into a broader public destination. Restoration projects patched roofs, cleaned stone, and stabilized the interiors. The Musée Condé opened more fully to paying visitors. Schools organized trips. Tourists added it to their just outside Paris list. At the same time, a new industry grew up around places like Chantilly, the heritage economy. Chantilly wasn't just a museum anymore. It was marketed as a day trip from Paris, a showpiece of French art and architecture, a landscape of gardens, forest, and water, ideal for weekend walks, a center for horse culture, thanks to the great stables and equestrian shows. The same stables that once projected aristocratic power were reborn as a horse museum and performance space. Riding shows, dressage demonstrations, and later multimedia events started using the monumental building that had once been built for a prince's animals. The estate also began hosting events, fireworks nights, garden festivals, historical reenactments, corporate evenings, luxury weddings. The chateau and stables appeared in films, TV series, fashion shoots, and advertising campaigns. Chantilly became content. One clear example is its appearance in the James Bond film A View to a Kill. In that movie, the chateau plays the part of a villain's estate, a super-rich horse-breeding tycoon. Once again, the same architecture that had hosted real nobles now played the backdrop for fictional, slightly sinister wealth. It fits a pattern. Modern culture still recognizes Chantilly as a symbol of power and money, but now that power is fictional, stylized, and safe. The real decisions that shape the world are made in offices and data centers, not in chateaux. Meanwhile, behind the camera and beyond the events, the everyday grind continues. The cost of maintaining Chantilly is relentless. Conservation is expensive. Skilled stonemasons, roofers, conservators, and archivists are not cheap. Climate change brings new problems: heavier rains, harsher storms, hotter summers that stress old materials. Ticket sales help. So do public subsidies, private donations, sponsorships, and partnerships with foundations. But the balance is always delicate. If prices go too high, ordinary visitors are shut out. If they stay too low, there isn't enough money to keep up with repairs and conservation. So Chantilly walks a narrow line. Inside, it's a serious museum and research site. Outside, it's an Instagram backdrop. On the lawns and in the courtyards, you might see influencers posing in dramatic outfits, couples taking wedding photos, families buying ice cream. Inside, in the dim light of the library, a conservator turns the page of a 500-year-old manuscript with gloved hands, and over all of it hangs a quiet question. What are we really preserving here? Are we preserving objects, paintings, books, and buildings as neutral cultural treasures? Or are we also preserving, in a softer way, the memory of a social order built on inequality? In one sense, Chantilly today is a success story. It survived revolution, confiscation, partial demolition, 2 world wars, and more than a century of political upheaval. It employs people, attracts visitors, and protects art that might otherwise have been lost. In another sense, it's a warning. To keep a place like this alive, we turn it into a product, a destination, a venue, a brand. Château de Chantilly becomes a logo. The same waters that once reflected the power of the Condés now reflect fireworks, drone shots, and smartphone screens. The world that built Chantilly is gone. But the shell of that world still makes money, still consumes resources, still sits in the middle of a forest and whispers, "Remember us." If you stand on the main bridge at Chantilly at the end of the day, the water goes dark first. The stone stays bright for a moment longer, soft gold on the walls, pale edges on the balustrades, and then the whole place slowly sinks into blue. The windows light up from inside. Tourists drift away. The last photos are taken. The gates begin to close. This is when Chantilly looks most like what it really is, a beautiful shell. We've followed this estate across 6 centuries, from medieval fortress to Renaissance residence, from Montmorency to Condé, from the Grand Condé's golden age to revolutionary destruction, from a prince shot in a moat to an exiled duke rebuilding a fantasy, from private palace to locked museum to heritage brand. So what does it all add up to? Let's start with the human cost. Behind every stage of Chantilly's story, there are people whose names we don't know. Peasants and tenants who paid rents and taxes that funded building campaigns, gardens, horse palaces, and lavish parties. Workers who dug canals, dragged stones, cut trees, and shaped the land into perfect geometric lines. Servants, grooms, cooks, and cleaners who kept the machine running, including people like Vatel, crushed by the pressure to make everything perfect for masters who always wanted more. Soldiers who died in wars commanded or supported by the men whose portraits now hang calmly on the walls. Families who lived through revolution, famine, and violence, while estates like this became targets for their anger and symbols of their suffering. Chantilly compresses all that into a single, extremely photogenic object. Then there is the cost to the people at the top. The Montmorency paid with execution and confiscation. The Condé paid with exile, loss, and a prince shot in the dark. The Orléans paid with revolutions, abdication, and the slow realization that their thrones were never coming back. For the Duke of Aumale, the cost was deeply personal. He outlived his children, his political relevance, and the world that had made his rank meaningful. He poured his fortune and his energy into rebuilding Chantilly, not because he thought he could bring the old regime back, but because he couldn't accept that the story of his class would simply end in ruins and auction catalogs. Chantilly is his refusal, carved in stone. Financially, the cost is both past and present. In the past, fortunes were sunk into horses, gardens, art, and performances, things that looked impressive, but often did little to address the growing crises underneath French society. Today, money keeps flowing into restoration, staffing, and conservation, all to maintain an estate that no longer has any real political purpose. There's a strange irony there. A building that once existed to show off wealth now constantly needs money just to keep from falling apart. Emotionally, there's another layer. Places like Chantilly are seductive. It's easy to walk through the halls and imagine yourself in silk or velvet, strolling the gardens, riding out with the hunt. The uncomfortable truth is that almost none of us would have been those people. Most of us would have been outside the chateau walls, in the fields or in the servants' quarters, cleaning, carrying, obeying. And yet we still come. We pay for tickets. We take photos. We say it's beautiful. That's the final trick of Chantilly. It turns a world built on inequality into a place we feel lucky to visit. The same aristocratic fantasy that once justified huge gaps between rich and poor reappears as harmless heritage, something to consume for fun. Does that mean places like this shouldn't exist? Not necessarily. Chantilly also protects things that are genuinely priceless: art, knowledge, architecture, and landscape design that would be tragic to lose. The paintings and manuscripts here are part of human history now, not just aristocratic history. The estate provides jobs. It teaches visitors about the past. It gives us a physical space where we can think about how power used to look. But to be honest about Chantilly, you have to hold two truths at the same time. It is a treasure, and it is a monument to a system that hurt a lot of people. It preserves beauty, and it shows how easily beauty can be built on top of someone else's struggle. In the end, Chantilly survives because we've decided it's worth the effort to keep it standing. That decision says something about us. We could have chosen to let more estates like this crumble, to focus only on the future. Instead, we spend time, money, and care on maintaining a place that constantly reminds us of inequality, fragility, and failure. Maybe that's the real value of the chateau now,